Good morning, I'm Gail Christian, and this is another edition of your Women's Circle Live. This month is Black History Month, and we've got a special edition of the show with two very special guests. First, Alexis De Veaux, the author of Warrior Poet, the biography of Audrey Lorde. We are delighted to have Alexis back again. This will be her second appearance. She opened the show for us on the first day we started. Joining her will be her spouse, Sokari Ekine, a Nigerian photographer and writer and visual scholar. This program is brought to you by your Women's Circle, which is an organization for gay and lesbian women to resource, exchange information, make friends, talk about their business interests. Check it out. Visit yourwomencircle.com. You may want to join the organization or at least come up with our activities. Before we begin the show by talking to Alexis, I'd like to say a little bit about the fact that this is, in fact, Black History Month. To me, I try to make Black History Month every day of the year because the minute you slow down, you will fall off the treadmill and have to start all over again. But a couple of things I wanted to say. And one, this is a very different Black History Month than in the past. This is not the same civil rights movement for social justice that we were talking about back in the 50s and 60s when, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and during the March on Washington. One of the primary differences was that at that time in the 1950s, 60s, and thereafter, the movement was led and motivated by the church. And while the church was very interested in social justice for Black people, it was not at all interested in social justice for gays and queers. That is not the same today. Today, this movement, the Black rights movement, the social justice movement that we're looking at now, has been motivated by queers and trans men and women to a great deal. They have been in the forefront of this movement. They have been making decisions. They have been strategizing, and it is a much more welcoming movement than it was before. And part of that motivation for this new movement that is more perhaps internet identified than church identified are people like Audrey Lorde. And that's why we invited Alexis to come on and continue an earlier conversation we had about the impact of Audrey Lorde on Black politics and on the queer community. And Alexis, if I can see your face, then we can start this interview at this point.
Hi, good morning.
Nice
How are you,
seeing
sweetie?
Nice seeing you. We got a little shaky start there. You could tell I was forgetting my pronouns, ma'am.
That's all right. That's all right.
But I think we'll just let you talk about Audrey Lorde, and I'll ask you maybe some questions at the end of your presentation instead of doing it the usual way.
Okay, that sounds good, baby. Once again, thank you for inviting me back to your Women's Circle. It's a great honor and it's a pleasure, particularly at this point in time, to have another opportunity to talk with the listening and viewing audience about Audrey Lorde and her contributions, yes, but the ways in which her life and her work have shaped Black lesbian thought, Black feminist lesbian thought, Black feminist queer thought, and queer thought in general. And I think it's really great that we're taking the time to think about her right now, because last Thursday we marked her 87th birthday, and for that birthday we got the gift of Audrey Lorde being inducted into the American Poets Corner, which is a prestigious induction at the Cathedral St. John the Divine in New York City, which is also one of the places where a massive memorial gathering was held for her. So when we talk about Audrey Lorde, we really have to talk about Lorde's life and also her afterlife. And that's the way I would sort of like to frame today. And I want to begin, Gail, by just doing what I would call a cinematic look at Lord's life. And I say cinematic because I want to encourage us to think about the importance of one day doing a film, having a biopic on Audrey Lorde. So one of the first things we want to remember, because so many of us can quote her, but we take those quotes without really thinking about the life that the quotes are generated from. So one of the first things I want to point out is that Lorde was a child of Caribbean immigrants who came to the United States sometime in the 1920s and settled in Harlem. And at the time, Harlem was a boiling pot, if you will, of multiple kinds of Blackness. Blackness coming from the Caribbean, coming from Africa, northern urban Blacks, and Black people who were migrating to Harlem from the South. So there was a lot of Blackness, but there was also a lot of difference. And Lorde came into life understanding, as a child, understanding her difference, both in the context of her nuclear family and in the wider context of that, what was then Harlem. By the time Lorde gets to her early 20s, she escapes her family life, which had been fairly strict. Her parents were not willing, particularly her mother, was not willing to allow their daughters to engage that Black life that was just beyond their doors. So Lorde sought freedom, and she escapes that Harlem world, if you will, and participates in a more bohemian experience in Greenwich Village in New York City. And we have to remember that at the time, in the 1950s, early 1960s, the bohemian scene becomes home for people who would identify as homosexual, gay, lesbian, and queer. And it's not necessarily a Black world, it's a bohemian world. And this is the world that Lorde is largely in. And I think it's important to point out that in her 20s, she both identifies as lesbian and also marries a white gay man. Now, a lot of us don't really remember that about Lorde and don't think about it in the context of the Black lesbian feminist poet Mother Warrior that comes to us later. But these moments are foundational to who Lorde becomes. So in her 20s and her 30s, she is both identifying as a lesbian and also living this fairly normative life with a white gay man with whom she has 2 children. Lorde's life really changes, though, in 1977. So she's in her early 40s at that point because she was born in 1934. And this is her first engagement with the possibility that she has cancer. And I would argue that that Audrey Lorde actually lives 2 lives, the life before cancer and the life after and then with cancer. And I say after and then with is because in 1977, when she first has a sense that this might be possible, and then in 1978, when she has her mastectomy, that's the life that she lives before and up to that point of the first indication of cancer. And then between 1978, 1979, and 1984, she continues to thrive, but always with the threat of the possibility of cancer. And then in 1984, she is diagnosed with metastasized liver cancer. So there are these multiple moments in Lorde's life in which the cancer comes to impact her. And I think it's really important for us to think about the ways in which cancer produces an Audrey Lorde that is actually on fire. There's very few ways to say that. She produces 2 masterworks between 1980 and 1982. One, the Cancer Journals, which is, and I call it a masterwork because it's the first text that we see written by an out Black lesbian at that point, because she comes out publicly in 1974. So in 1980, when she produces the Cancer Journals, she is really inserting the Black lesbian body into the medical knowledge about breast cancer and into public discourse around cancer and breast cancer and Black women. It's the first text that we have of that kind. And it's an important text for thinking about what it means to be a Black lesbian and to undergo all of the procedures related to having a mastectomy, to thinking about one's body, which is the source of joy and delight, and also the source of life. So between 1978 and 1984, when Lord produces the Cancer Journals, and then she goes on to produce Zami, which comes out in 1982. So within 2 years of the Cancer Journals, she has a second masterwork, and this work helps to do something that again had not been done before, that is to insert a clearly Black lesbian narrative into both feminist literature and Black literature. Because prior to that time, we have that hole. There's a hole, both in feminist literature and in Black literary production. So, and Zami is, as Lord calls it, a biomythography. And a lot of us want to think that it's an autobiography, but it's not. It's and Lord talks about that to some degree. And she talks about, again, the importance of producing this Black lesbian narrative, and the importance of the myth, the processes of myth making to the story that she's telling. So it's not her story in particular. It is situated in some of her experiences, but it's an amalgamation of Black lesbian experiences, because Lord doesn't really get with Black lesbian community until in her own life. She doesn't get with Black lesbian community until the 1970s. So her life as a lesbian, as I said before, is shaped largely by her relation to Bohemian culture, and also to a number of primarily white women who were also functioning as lesbians in the 1950s, living life as lesbians in the 1950s and the 1960s. So we have, in this period between 1978 and 1984, the return of the cancer, an explosion in Audrey Lorde's life, in the numbers of works that she produces. Again, the Cancer Journals, Zami, a number of poetry texts, her collection of essays, Sister Outsider, but also the multiple ways in which Lorde is functioning as an activist. And she, often said there is no such thing as a one-issue movement. And that's the beginning of what we understand today as intersectionality. Lorde's theorizing, if you will, around the importance of looking at multiple issues in a life, and the multiple ways in which a life, particularly Black women's lives, have been oppressed. So these works are very important, and their importance comes to us today, again, as ways in which the poet Audrey Lorde theorizes around the issues facing Black women in particular, but also now she's looking at Black diasporic women, because again, as she develops this extraordinary international reputation in the 1980s and the 1990s, she is looking at Black women who live in the United States, who live in the Caribbean, who live in Europe, who live in Africa. So she is now beginning to think openly and speak openly about a Black diasporic women's experience. And that, I think, is really important for us to remember. So when we think about some of the Lord-isms that have come to us, your silence will not protect you, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, there's no such thing as a one-issue movement, and there are a number of Lord-isms or Lord quotes that we are left with. So by the time 1984, when Lord is diagnosed with metastatic liver cancer, Lord at that point has also met Gloria Joseph, Dr. Gloria Joseph, who lives in St. Croix. And Gloria Joseph introduces Lord to Black women and Black women's community in the Caribbean, particularly in St. Croix, where Joseph, who was born in St. Croix, lives. And it's this moment of seeing herself in community with other Black Caribbean women, lesbian and not, that Lord makes the decision to leave the United States and live in the Caribbean. And in my biography, Warrior Poet, I take the position that Lord was spiritually homeless throughout most of her life. And by that, I mean she attempted to enter into multiple homes or multiple communities, if you will, Black community, lesbian community, literary community, on and on and on, and always felt on some level not satisfied with or not satiated by access to those worlds. And to my mind, it's not until she is back in the Caribbean with a Black woman, Gloria Joseph, that she's able to spiritually come to terms with who she is. And that meant that she also had to leave Frances Louise Clayton, who had been her partner for more than 20 years. I believe they met in 1968 at Tougaloo in Mississippi. And Clayton pretty much gives up her life to live with Lord in New York City and help raise Lord's two children. And for me, one of the sadder moments in attempting anything that would constitute the biography was not having access to Frances Clayton, who at the time simply opted to just not talk to me about Audrey Lorde at all. She just didn't want to be involved with the project. I believe Frances Clayton passed away in 2012.
Alexis, can I jump in here? I said I wasn't going to.
Sure.
Before we get into the 80s, I want to try to make that connection. I think that we're talking about the 70s. I want to make that connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the collective of women that Audrey Lorde belonged to in the 70s. Is it clear what I'm talking about?
Yeah, are you talking about Kambahi, the Kambahi collective?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there a connection can we say that her experience in that collective was drawn upon by Black Lives Matter? Because I know you haven't talked about the collective yet. I wanted you to speak about that for a moment before we get too far ahead of that period.
Okay. I think when you look at collectives like Black Visions in Minneapolis, when you look at the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement coming out of Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, when you look at Free Black Dirt also coming out of Minneapolis, I mean, there are multiple examples around the world, but these organizations, these movements, this notion of Black Lives Matter being led by largely queer people is definitely tied to organizations like the Combahee River Collective, because the Combahee River Collective was a first. It was the first to articulate what we now call intersectional, what was then called multiple oppressions. So it was the first to articulate and promote the notion of Black freedom being tied to not just race, but to gender, to sexuality, to class, etc. So yeah, there's no stretch of the imagination to understand what happened in the 1970s in Audrey Lorde's life, in the life of Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, and a number of others. It's not a stretch to make that connection. We would not have what we have today were it not for the kinds of activisms that Lorde and a number of other Black women and also women of color organized around and made part of our public realities back in the 1970s. But it's really in the 1980s, though. It's really in the 1980s when all that organizing begins to flourish in multiple ways. At the end of the 1970s, we see Lorde, for example, speaking at the first March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. That took place in 1979, but it bridges the 1980s in terms of the work that she was doing. So I might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but that's okay. We do see the 1970s, the organizing of the 1970s creating certain kinds of moments, but those moments flourish in the 1980s. They're much closer in the 1980s and the 1990s. They're much closer to us than they are not. Does that help you?
No, it absolutely does. I wanted to make that point.
Okay.
Are we ready to move on? Are there other things you want to say about?
Yeah, I really want us all to think about Audrey Lorde's afterlife, not just her life, but her afterlife. And I'll sort of shift from thinking about her life by just saying this. When she moves to the Caribbean in 1986, she lives on another 6 years. She doesn't leave this life until 1992, but she lives on another 6 years, really both continuing to write, continuing to be the woman that she is, and continuing to lay the groundwork for the ways in which we can think about her today. In 1991, a year before she passes away, she becomes the poet laureate of New York State. And that's part of Lorde's legacy. She is the first Black queer person to become poet laureate in the United States. So when we talk about the ways in which, now I want to do that, talk about some of the ways in which Audrey Lorde has shaped, and not just contributed to, but shaped Black feminist thought, Black lesbian feminist thought, Black feminist queer thought, and queer thought in general. We have to do that in the context of looking at, again, the movements of today, Black Visions, Free Black Dirt, the Black Feminist Mobile Homecoming in Durham, North Carolina, which is co-created by Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Shangadari Akinwale. There's also an organization called Zami Nola, which is a national organization of lesbians aging. These are just in the United States, although they, I think, also have international impact. So another point that I think is important for us to think about are what are the ways in which Lorde theorized being a lesbian that we are still living with today. And key to that is recognizing that Lorde forwarded a theory of difference. That notion that difference was something that we had to treat with, that we couldn't have the sort of melting pot discourse that comes out of American thought, is an important way that we look at difference today, because we understand how difference shapes looking at racial experiences, sexual experiences, class experiences, etc. And that theory of difference is one that multiple scholars have treated with since Audrey Lorde. And that's that goes along with Lord's transformation of silence into language and action, for example. That's another Lordism, but it's also a theory about how to move out of the silence that might be killing us into a language about it and then into action. And this is, if you will, a blueprint for multiple communities today, multiple ways in which people have understood that, one, their silence will not protect them. Two, that once we put into language the things that we are struggling against, then three, we can act on that. We can act on those struggles. So I think it's really critical that we not only are able to quote Audrey Lorde, but that we're also able to understand the context in which those quotes have been shaped. And the context here is that life. So when I think about Lorde's impact, there's very little today in terms of the kinds of activism that we're seeing that don't have a direct link to something she did or the work that she did. And let's not forget, she was internationally known. She was just not known in the United States. She was internationally known. She had an international impact. She was able to help shape Afro-German women in Berlin in a number of years that she spent in Berlin before she passed from this life. So for me, when I think about the ways in which she has impacted contemporary realities, I also think about the Black diasporic realities, Black women's diasporic realities that she touched upon as she moved from one geography to another.
Alexis, thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. Did I cut you off before you had a final thought there?
No, I'm good.
This is wonderful. You know, when we put this show together, we said that I said anyway, that the thing that I thought was most important about doing your Women's Circle Live was that it became an opportunity to think about and to talk about things that were important to the lesbian communities, not to entertain, but to inform and to educate. And you've certainly done that this morning, as usual, as you always do whenever I see you in the world.
I hope that I have been helpful, Gail, and I appreciate you.
You know, I was joining you is your wonderful, delightful, attractive, talented spouse, and that's a great. And I was going to introduce her, but I think I'll let you introduce her because I think you know her better than I do. And if that's not true, I'm certainly not going to bring it up in this conversation. So why don't you introduce your spouse and talk about the photography and talk about the things that you are collaborating on as we make a transition from your literary life to your artistic life. And I see that I've got a frozen picture here. So thank you. Can we bring up Sokari, or are we sort of down for a moment here? It looks as though we're having some problems here, so I'm going to talk until they have been corrected. Sokari Ekine is a Nigerian photographer. She is Alexis' spouse, and together they have done some collective work that has been quite incredible that we hope to be able to show you. Alexis, you're back?
Yes. So,
okay. Did you go to the bathroom? What was that?
No. There seemed to have been a internet connection issue.
Okay, I was saying that I was going to talk about your collective work with Sokari, but I think you can perhaps talk about it even better than me. You want to tell us about
Sure.
the move from?
I'm happy to. Sokari Ekine is a Nigerian. There she is, a Nigerian British photographer. She is a visual scholar. She engages as a Black feminist queer person, engages the world through sight. I think that that's a very interesting thing about her, that it's the way that she sees us as Black queer people that becomes the subject of her photography making. I remember when I first met her, I said something about her being a photographer, and she said, "I make photos." And that aspect, that correction was an interesting one at the time. But that aspect of making, of image making, I think is a really huge part of the work that she does. She also is a deeply spiritual person, and that spirituality comes through both in the photographs that she makes, but also in the ways that she understands Black diasporic spiritual practices.
And I understand that you have actually brought a work that you can share with the audience that we can buy. I'm certainly very anxious to see it and have you talk about it. And I'm going to be your first sale. So,
oh, wonderful. We do, as artists, collaborate. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of our, what we call lovership. And this work that we collaborated on is called Breath Erotica. It is a poem that I wrote for Sokari. And it's, oh, there it is, yes. And it's married to one of her photographs, which is called Breath. I'm going to let her talk about it. The poem itself talks about the multiple ways of being erotic for women in our 60s. We met when we were in our 60s. And I think this kind of, goes back to the Audrey Lorde moment and thinking about what it means to experience oneself erotically as we are aging and as we see ourselves as part of that Black diasporic women's experience. So this is one of the collaborations that we have, and I'm sure Sokari is going to talk about it more specifically. We've done others. We've done a zine together. And so I'm going to let Sokari pick it up from here. She is an amazing artist, and I'm so happy to be in her life.
Sokari, before you start, and we move away from this picture, can you tell us where this is a poster? Am I correct that this has been turned into a poster, this photo? And where can we get it, and how much does it cost?
Excuse me. It's a poster. You can get it through my website, sokariekine.me, and at the moment it's $50.
Okay, can you? Oh, yes, I can see your website, sokariekine.me. $50. I encourage all of you to take a look at Sokari's work. It's wonderful. And this poster is absolutely beautiful, and it'll be a wonderful addition to your collection. And go on.
Yeah, I would like to add to it that Alexis and I created this poster of poetry and the photograph as part of a ceremony that we had. A ceremony of our lovership, which we had in 2018. So that was the context in which we created this broadside, or as you call it, poster. This particular photograph is, the photograph is part of a series called Spirit Desire, and it's part of my work. Most of my work centers on the African diasporic spiritual practices. And this work comes out of Haiti, where I spent about 6 years living, and also spending a lot of time in spiritual compounds and, learning and understanding about Haiti and about voodoo. So this particular photograph I called Breath, and it's one of four. It's the actual sequence when the women are apart, and it's in a ceremony where there is dance and obviously music, and they're apart, and then the next movement you see is one of them is wiping the sweat off the other woman, and then there's this moment, and then the moment they separate, and it's just so incredibly beautiful. It represents what I feel and what excites me and moves me in voodoo, in that there's that intimacy, there's that, in this case, sisterhood, there's that love, but there's also the energy of the spirits which are around it. And it's like they are just breathing on each other's, just taking from each other's breath. And that's what is their, where they're getting their energy. So it's not your energy yourself, it's a kind of mutual exchange of energies. So that's why I particularly love this photograph, which is called Breath.
It's absolutely lovely. Would you give us the your website one more time?
SokariEkine.me.
And they will be able to see other works if they go to the site. And can you tell us about some of the other things they'll find there?
Yeah, as I said, my work centers on African diasporic spiritual practices. And the reason I was able to create, and why I was able to create this beautiful series, Spirit Desire, from which this one comes, is because of my time in Haiti and living in the actual spiritual compounds.
What is this photo that we're looking at now?
This one, I call it The Wake. It's actually from the same ceremony as the two women. And I just love this one because of the movement. That is just flowing and the light that is just shining through. So I called it The Wake. Somehow or other, it just felt like the wake, as in the afterlife or the afterwards of slavery, but that it's a resistance and a persistence that brought voodoo into Haiti in the first place. So I call it The Wake, as you celebrate.
I'm sorry, is this an actual voodoo ceremony we're looking at?
Yes.
This is not staged for the photograph.
No.
Actual voodoo ceremony.
No, there's no staging.
That's cool. Yeah.
All the photographs, the one previous, Breath, is also from a ceremony as well.
Oh, how nice is that? Are there more of these? Are there other photographs? I think there's some more photographs. Let's bring up another one, because I've never seen, and probably most people have never seen a photo from a voodoo ceremony. And
this is one of my favorites. This is absolutely one of my favorites.
This is called Liquid, and it's from another ceremony, not the same one. And it's this young woman, just fell into the water, and at that moment she engages with the spirit, and that's why her hand is up and very stiff. And
but she's also possessed.
She's also possessed. I didn't want to use that word, so I said she's engaged with the spirits.
Can we see? Is this the same part of the same photo, or is this another?
No, this is from another series, Takasa, which is in Kenya, from Kenya, and it's part of a project that I was working with queer Muslim identified Kenyans, and we were talking and looking at how we express ourselves as Muslims, and how that kind of engages with queerness at the same time. So this was on the coast, on the Indian Ocean, and this photograph is called Wudu, which Wudu is the cleansing ritual that Muslims engage with before they pray. So this was a ceremony to bathe in the waters and later on to go through some other rituals around cleansing in Kenya on the Indian Ocean.
Just fascinating.
And this is also from the same series. Yeah, this is from the same series.
Now, is this person also possessed?
At this time, I would say so, yes. Yes. But this is in Kenya. The other one was in Haiti.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
And then next one.
And this one?
Mm-hmm.
This one is actually from Louisiana, from New Orleans, and is part of a series, Altars, Black queer ecologies of the spirit, in which I look at how we as Black queer people engage with the making and creating of altars, and how we engage with African diasporic spiritual practices, and how we use those as they are or as a foundation to create our own ritual around spiritual practice. And so this one was taken in a forest in New Orleans, and these are friends of mine. They had gone there and they had created an altar by the waterside with found objects. And I love this because it reminds me of the breath as the two of them side. It's just the energy between them, the intimacy, just the beauty and the love, and just the kind of resistance that is in that photograph.
It's wonderful. Oh, well, who's that?
And this is also part of the older. Yeah, so this is Alexis, and it's there isn't time to show more, but Alexis has an altar. We visited Ghana in 2018, and when we returned, Alexis created an altar to the ancestors, and which there are artifacts collected from Elmina Castle in Ghana, and water from the ocean, sand, and photographs, and so that was her altar that she created after Ghana, just particularly for the ancestors, her ancestors.
Well,
that's
marvelous. This is just marvelous. Was that the last photo?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
Are these photos available? I'm sorry. You'd think you were interviewing me instead of me talking over you, but I got so excited. Are these photos available both individually, and do they come in a series?
Each of those ones I showed you are part of a series within the African diasporic spiritual practice. The first one is Spirit Desire, which is in Haiti. Then there's the Takasa, which comes out of Kenya, and then there's the Altars, which comes out of the Gulf states. So photographs are available individually, and if people wanted to buy, a set, they could as well. So the photographs are affordable and are available via my website, via the contact box on the website. So if people were interested, they should contact me, because depending on the price and the material used to print, that depends on the cost.
Now, have you thought about doing a virtual show so that we could look at all of your work virtually?
No, but I would love to do that. I would like to say that there's a book that I produced, which is based on the work in Haiti, which is called Spirit Desire, Resistance, Imagination, and Sacred Memories in Haitian Voodoo. So this is also available on the website as well. This one here.
Wow.
Build it up. Yeah. But yes, I would love to do a virtual show.
I don't know what to say. Alexis, this is the first time we've had a power couple on. So I'm quite impressed, I have to say. Voodoo and all. I mean, I am
we're so happy. We're so happy for you and the show and all of the crew who put it together, and to just give us an opportunity to say something about what we have done and are doing and how we imagine that we're going to, go forward. I think it's really important. This platform, Your Women's Circle, is a wonderful way of bringing these realities to this great listening and viewing audience that is going to be growing. We are confident it's going to be growing. So we can have someone like Sokari Ekine, and maybe Your Women's Circle could be the place of the virtual exhibition.
Well, why not?
Mm-hmm.
All things are possible. That's why we're here. I want to thank both of you. This has been an extraordinary morning, and I love both of you. Alexis, you know how I feel about your work, and Sokari, I have been converted. I'm a fan, and if you will just continue to stay possessed, both of you. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and happy Black History Month, if there's such an expression. And take care, and and keep doing what you do.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Every day. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Alexis did a plug better than I could have done it, but I want to remind you that this show is produced and paid for from the dues from the women who belong to Your Women's Circle, where we hope that you will come each week to hear new and interesting things. It's been a pleasure. I'm Gail Christian. I'll see you next Monday morning, and thank you again for joining us.